You have something to do with the projector or no? Only sister.
Yeah.
In the meantime, you can also turn, everybody can turn the cell phone off. I'll put you on silent, please. Cell phone, this is cell phone. Put you on turn off. I'll put you on silent.
So is there any program locally? EA or OIFI, are they local?
No, so
They're in Malaysia?
no, they're based in Bahrain, but they're international. Like, so basically, what you do is they have their standards that they publish online, and then they have exams every few months. So
So
you can
what is
take
the
their
requirement to take to
exam.
join?
Anyone can apply to take the exam. You just have to study those standards,
Okay.
and then you pass the exam and you get certified.
Maybe we can connect afterwards.
Yeah, sure,
Maybe I
sure.
can be able to look up on it and show. I graduated from my Alimia program in Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah, I started at Azadville.
Yeah.
My dad passed away in the first year of my study, and I'm from Guyana originally, so I had to move closer to Guyana, which was in Trinidad.
I see. Okay.
So I'm Guyanese.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I did my I did most of it here actually in New York, in
Yes.
New York, and then I did my final 2 years, my Dora, I did in Chicago.
Very good. Very good. I see it. You know Malana Ocean from Florida?
No, I don't think
He's one of my uncle. He usually comes here to New York a lot of times. So like my 2 years since I've been at this masjid.
How are you liking it?
It's good. Very nice
What
community.
is your position, like resident scholar here, or imam, or
Together with that, assistant imam.
assistant imam? Right. Okay.
So today one of the imams have his day off.
Sheikh Junaid, right?
So I'm his
I see. Okay. Assistant.
There's other like multiple brothers who would lead Salah in between during the weekends and so on.
Yeah.
And they would all play their role in leading the Salahs and stuff.
Okay.
We give them exposure.
Some of your
Yeah, they
because
want the youth, right? Like
fan may not be
yes,
working
they need
because
exposure.
there is a tip on the top. So you
We
take
don't
the tip.
take all of it for ourselves.
yeah,
You know.
You have to take the tip off.
Bengali? You're Bengali? You look like Chinese.
I've been told that before. People tell me I look Chinese.
Everyone was excited about this workshop.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
It's been like 3 weeks now
Yeah.
since we've been talking about
Announcing.
it. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Mashallah. That's good. I mean, actually, this is mainly Sister Amina. She's the one that's mainly doing the main thing. She just asked me to join to like give the Islamic perspective, but all the legal stuff, the technical stuff, she's gonna be discussing it. Yeah.
Siddiqui or Siddiqui?
Sadiq, Adil Sadiq.
Sadiq.
Oh. Yeah, it's just spelled like that. That's
It's a good thing I asked.
yeah, yeah. Adil Sadiq.
Yeah.
I see it. Perfect.
Your master's from Malaysia?
Okay, you ready?
Ready?
Are you using this one?
Yes.
Okay, so now. Can use this one. This
Give
one.
it to me.
You can start now.
SQ stand for?
Esquire. It's a title for lawyers.
So I just say her name and Esquire.
I guess, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, I didn't get a good response. Let's get a better one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Better. Jazakumullah. We want to welcome each and every one of you, our beloved brothers and sisters, to today's seminar, A Muslim's Guide to Islamic Wills, Trust and Estate Planning, a special collaborative program between Hillside Islamic Center and Amana Legal. We are here to fulfill a vital communal and religious duty, ensuring our legacy is preserved in accordance with the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the laws of the land itself. Our guest speakers today, I have the privilege of introducing our Mufti Adil Sadiq, a Queens-born scholar and finance professional. After completing his Alimiya and Ifta studies, he earned his master's in Islamic finance from Malaysia, and he is an AAOIFI certified Sharia advisor who currently works with Guidance Residential, bridging traditional scholarship with modern financial solutions. And on my left is no other than our sister Amina Rashad, and she's an experienced attorney and the founder of Amana Legal. With over a decade of legal expertise, Sister Amina specializes in Islamic estate planning and family law. She's also currently pursuing advanced Islamic studies to become an alima. May Allah make it possible and successful for her, inshallah. And she's also focusing on the intersection of US law and the Sharia values. And our discussion today is rooted in the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who emphasized that estate planning is not a task to be delayed. As he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, "Ma haqqu imri'in muslimin lahu shay'un yusi fihi yabitu laylatain illa wasiyatuhu maktubatun indahu." What this means, it is the duty of every Muslim who has anything to be bequeathed not to let 2 nights pass without writing a will with it. And this is reported in Sahih al-Bukhari. With this, inshallah, I would like to call upon our youth, our youngster Abdurrahman, to recite some Quran, inshallah. Jazakum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسيق الذين اتقوا ربهم إلى الجنة زمرا حتى إذا جاءوها وفتحت أبوابها وقال لهم خزنتها سلام عليكم طبتم فادخلوها خالدين وقالوا الحمد لله الذي صدقنا وعده وأورثنا الأرض نتبوأ من الجنة حيث نشاء فنعم أجر العاملين وترى الملائكة حافين من حول العرش يسبحون بحمد ربهم وقضي بينهم بالحق وقيل الحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Jazakumullahu khair, Brother Abdul Rahman, for that beautiful recitation of the Holy Quran. It is my pleasure to now call to the podium our beloved Mufti Adil to make his presentation, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. أما بعد قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يا أبا هريرة تعلموا الفرائض وعلموها فإنه نصف العلم وهو ينسى وهو أول شيء ينزع من أمتي. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من مات على وصية مات على سبيل وسنة ومات على تقى وشهادة ومات مغفورا له أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending salutations upon Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We show our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing us to have such an event, for allowing us all to attend such an event. And of course, we also are grateful to the Hillside Islamic Center management, the Imam, as well as Amana Legal for organizing this event, this extremely important event that is relevant to all of us. So, before we get into like the technicalities and the legalities behind estate planning, which Sister Amina will handle inshallah, I wanted to give a brief introduction into why estate planning is so important for us as Muslims. Why should we even be concerned with this in the first place? Right? Many of us might think that, oh, you know, estate planning and having a will and putting my assets in trusts and all of these things is for people who are really wealthy and they have assets to put. They have assets that, you know, that they're worried about. But what if I'm, you know, I'm just a regular, regular income earner. I'm not necessarily very wealthy. It doesn't really apply to me. I'm not really leaving much behind anyways, right? Why do I need to be concerned with this? But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed us that it doesn't matter what you have. It doesn't matter if you have a lot. It doesn't matter if you have a little. It is an obligation upon every Muslim to ensure that whatever they have is distributed according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the laws of Islam after their passing. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he once was telling Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, he said, Ya Abu Hurairah, ta'allamul fara'id, learn inheritance, learn the laws of inheritance. وَعَلِّمُوهَا, and also teach it to other people. فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ, it is considered to be half of knowledge. So many scholars have discussed this hadith and they've mentioned, what did Rasulullah ﷺ mean when he said inheritance is half of knowledge? This is because inheritance deals with half of your existence, after your death. Whereas all of your ibadat, your muasharat, your muamalat, your dealings with other people, that's regarding your life. But we all tend to ignore that other aspect, which is what about after death? We all are familiar with the concept of sadaqah jariyah, right? Where you perhaps give some money in charity, you put some money towards building a well, towards building a masjid, and that continues to provide you with reward even after your passing, right? Every person who drinks water from that well, every person who performs salah in that masjid, you will continue to get reward. So we understand this concept of sadaqah jariyah, of your wealth having a benefit for you after you pass. In the same way, your wealth can also be a source of harm for you after you pass. If a person does not ensure that their assets are distributed correctly among their heirs, They do not ensure that they have a wasiyah, they have a will in which they mention that they, for example, they have an X amount of missed salahs, an X amount of mixed fasts, which should be paid from their estate. If we do not do these things, then we are sinful. If we do not ensure that our obligations are fulfilled after our passing, then in the same way that sadaqah jariyah continues to provide you benefit after your passing, your wealth will be a source of sin for you after your passing. So that's why, just at the very basic level, it is extremely important for everyone, no matter what assets you have, to have an estate plan, to have a plan for after you pass. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also tells us, "Man mata ala wasiyya, mata ala sabilin wa sunnah." A person who passes away with a will, meaning they have it all, everything spelled out already before they've passed. Mata ala sabilin wa sunnah. They've passed away upon the sunnah, first of all, but also upon a clear path, because they've made it clear for their heirs, for their beneficiaries, for their family members after they pass, how should their wealth be handled. As I'm sure many of us know within our own families, when this will or when this is missing in a family, when a person passes away and their heirs, their children, do not know how to properly distribute their wealth, it leads to fights. And I'm sure many of us are aware, probably within even our own families, brothers and sisters who no longer speak to each other over inheritance disputes, right? And all of this could be prevented and should be prevented, must be prevented by having a proper estate plan before passing away. Our Imam also mentioned this hadith, "Ma haqqu imri'in muslimin lahu shay'un yusi fihi yabitu laylatayn illa wasiyatuhu maktuban 'indah." It is not appropriate, it is not proper for a Muslim to pass away in such a state where he has something which he should have put in his wasiyah, something that he should have put in his will, to spend 2 nights. You can't to spend 2 nights without actually having written that will. So I'm sure all of us are in this situation where we have something which we should have in a will, and we are spending our entire lives thinking we don't know when death is going to come, we're not in any rush. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us it is not allowed for a Muslim to spend even 2 nights without ensuring that they have a will in place to ensure that their wealth, their estate is distributed properly upon their passing. We don't know when death will come. This is one of those things where the preparation is never too early, because we never know when it might happen. So it is important for every single one of us to have this in place. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also gives us one warning, and with this I'll move on inshallah. He tells us, "Inna ar-rajula la ya'malu bi'amali ahli al-khayri 70 sana." There's a person who may have lived his entire life, 70 years he lived in piety. He lived among the good, the righteous people. He lived according to the laws of Islam. He fulfilled all his obligations. He was a good Muslim for 70 years of his life. فَإِذَا أَوْصَى حَافَ فِي وَصِيَّتِهِ فَيُخْتَمُ لَهُ بِشَرِّ عَمَلِهِ فَيَدْخُلُ النَّارِ. This person who for 70 years of their life lived in accordance with the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, accordance with the laws of Islam, when it came فَإِذَا أَوْصَى, when he made his wasiyah, when he made his will, حَافَ فِي وَصِيَّتِهِ, he was unjust. He did not execute, or he did not ensure that his estate would be distributed properly upon his demise. فَيُخْتَمُ لَهُ بِالشَّرِّ عَمَلِهِ. So the very last stage of his life, it is sealed with an evil action. Meaning he lived his entire life in accordance with Islam. But now, upon his passing, this one last obligation that he had to fulfill, he didn't. Or he or she didn't. This person passes away without having a will in place, and with their estate now getting distributed, or whatever is being done with it, not in accordance with the laws of Islam. فَيُخْتَمُ لَهُ بِشَرِّ عَمَلِهِ فَيَدْخُلُ النَّارِ. His last action will be considered to be an evil action, and he will enter fire. Rasulullah ﷺ tells us in another hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالْخَوَاتِيمِ. Actions will be judged according to how they end. It's possible a person lived their entire life pious and righteous, but at the very end of their life, they committed a major sin, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not overlook. Similarly, the opposite. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam also tells us, وَإِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَيَعْمَلُ بِعَمَلِ أَهْلِ الشَّرِّ. It's possible a person lived their entire life, 70 years, committing sins. 70 سنة فَيَعْدِلُ فِي وَصِيَّتِهِ. But when it comes time, he's passing away and he's preparing his will, he is just. He ensures that all of his inheritors, all of his heirs get what they deserve to get according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed. فَيُخْتَمُ لَهُ بِخَيْرِ عَمَلِهِ. So now this person has ended his life with a good action. فَيَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةِ. So he will enter Jannah, despite having lived 70 years of his life in sin. ثم قال وَقْرَأُوا إِن شِئْتُمْ تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ إِلَىٰ قَوْلِهِ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam tells us in the beginning of Surah An-Nisa, this is where the verses of inheritance are discussed, where it discusses exactly who gets how many shares, your son gets this much, your daughter gets this much, your wife gets this much. It's all spelled out to the very last detail. Everything is clearly mentioned in those few verses. And at the very end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ. These are the boundaries, the limits that have been set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whoever follows and obeys, then they have achieved the true success. But whoever disobeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it comes to these matters of inheritance, then they will be in a disgraceful punishment. It's interesting that we have so many laws, of course, Sharia is, we have our rules that relate to ibadat, regarding salah, zakat, fasting, hajj. We have all of these rules. And as many of us are aware, we tend to have some difference of opinion when it comes to certain things. Some people perform salah one way, some people perform salah another way. That's not the topic of discussion here today, but the point is, we have difference of opinion, valid difference of opinion in many of these things. But inheritance and estate planning is one of the few things that we have in our tradition, within our fiqh, where you will very, very rarely see any difference of opinion among any scholars. Because it is so clearly mentioned in the Quran and so clearly mentioned in the hadith, exactly who gets how much, in what situation, if you're married, if you're unmarried, if you're divorced, if you have kids, if you have one daughter, if you have two daughters, if you have a daughter and two sons, if you have two daughters and one son, everything is spelled out. There is no room for anyone to say that I didn't know or I didn't. It's extremely clear, and it is an obligation upon every single one of us to learn this and ensure that our own estates are distributed properly. So this is a religious responsibility. Aside from the financial benefits and the legal benefits of having a wasiyah, it is a religious obligation upon us. And also, it doesn't necessarily just relate to finances. It relates to other things as well. It relates to guardianship of your children. It relates to anything that you would like to take place after your passing can be put into such a will. So it is necessary for all of us to begin planning early. That is the main point, right? We understand that it is important. It is a religious obligation. It is not something that is optional for us. It is a religious obligation for us to ensure that our wealth is distributed properly. So we must begin to plan early. Even in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, he had advised his companions on how to spend their wealth during their lifetime and also how to ensure that they have wealth left over after their passing. Right? We must all be familiar with these Sahabi radiallahu anhu who had plenty of wealth, and he wanted to donate all of his wealth into charity before he passed. But Rasulullah ﷺ told him, limited him only to 1/3 of his wealth, and he told him that you should leave something behind for your heirs. Right? It is a responsibility of every parent to have and express love and concern for their children who are following Islam, to leave something behind for them, to not leave them struggling. Right? And like I said, this applies to more than just the leaving money for your children, but it applies to who's going to take care of them after you pass away. What about you? What about if you, na'udh billah, we end up in some sort of accident and we end up on life support? What should be done in that case? Do we want our kids to leave us on life support forever? The fiqhi discussion regarding whether you're allowed to pull the plug, active euthanasia versus passive, that's a different discussion. But the point is, these are all things that we need to be aware of and we need to plan for. And it's unfortunate for us that, or there's two sides, but the unfortunate thing is that us living in the US, we are bound by the laws of the US. And if we pass away in a manner without having a will in place, without having our assets in a trust to ensure distribution properly, then whatever assets that we have will be distributed according to whatever the state law is, right? I mean, I'm sure Sister Amina can confirm when she speaks, but if we don't take these precautions beforehand, then once we pass away, it's too late. You can't do anything after that, right? So then we would be in a state of sin for not fulfilling this obligation. The way that the state or the country distributes your estate may not necessarily be in line with the way Islamically it's supposed to be distributed, which is why it is necessary for Muslims, specifically for Muslims, to have a will in place. That means that if a person passes away without a will, what could happen, right? Their kids, perhaps, I mean, again, the laws differ, but it could be such that all of their assets go to their spouse and their kids are left with nothing, or vice versa, or whatever the case is. There are specific percentages, specific shares that are allocated for each person in our family by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can only ensure that they actually get those shares by having a will in place before passing away. So in terms of like the specific tools that we can use to ensure that we have wills, we have trusts, and again, Sister Amina will most likely talk more a little bit about that, right? But these are tools that we use to ensure that our obligations are fulfilled. But even these tools also have certain considerations to ensure that when we are using these tools, that we are doing so in a halal manner as well. It's possible that a person may have a trust and they with a good intention, they've created a trust because they want to put their assets in this trust and they want to allocate certain percentages for certain beneficiaries of their family according to the laws of Islam. It's a good intention. But what if there are other considerations? There are other things that to ensure that this trust is actually fully halal. What if you're putting assets into a certain account and this account is earning interest, right? So there's many different considerations to that. Many things to consider when using these tools, which is why having events like this, having workshops like this is extremely important. Now getting into like what are some of those considerations, what should every person ensure is in their estate plan? So from the Islamic perspective at least, when a person passes away, their wealth goes towards 4 different avenues. The first is towards their funeral expenses. Their wealth should be put towards covering their funeral expenses. This includes the costs of a kafan, of the burial, of the graveyard plot, whatever it is, that is the first avenue towards which your wealth should be put when you pass away. Now, if a family member wants to sponsor this and wants to take care of it from their own end, that's great. They will be rewarded for that. But if there is no one, then the first thing is that your wealth goes towards your funeral expenses. Second is that wealth goes towards paying off whatever is left after that. It goes towards paying off debt. All right? And this is extremely important because Rasulullah ﷺ emphasized a lot that we should not pass away in a state where we have unpaid debts. Rasulullah ﷺ even once refused to perform the janazah of someone who passed away with debts. Then the following day, one of the other companions came and told Rasulullah ﷺ, I've covered all of his debts for him, I've paid it off. And Rasulullah ﷺ was then pleased with that situation, that you've now saved this person because this person passed away while owing people money. And by you paying off that person's debts, you have saved this person. So when a person passes away, after their funeral expenses, the next thing that their wealth should be put towards is paying off their debts. After that, the next thing that if there is anything left over, what their wealth gets put towards is their wasiyah. In Arabic, it's called wasiyah, which is a will or a bequest. This is 1/3 of a person's wealth, which they have the full right to do essentially whatever they want with. Right? As long as if they want to donate part of their wealth to charity, if they want to give some extra wealth to some of their family members who are not their heirs. Right? This is specifically for non-heirs because the people who will already inherit from them, they have their shares, they have their fixed shares already. So this 1/3 is for whatever a person wants. If they want to donate some towards charity, this 1/3 is also towards fulfilling any obligations that a person has with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If a person has missed salahs, missed fasts, then they have to pay fidya for those, right? Because they were never able to make them up during their lifetime, then they must be made up after their passing. Some money must be given on their behalf from their assets. Similarly, if a person during their lifetime was physically and financially capable to go for Hajj, but they never did. So this should be written in their will that it was necessary for me to perform Hajj, but I never did it. So from my heirs, someone please perform Hajj on my behalf. This is something that should be in your will, because otherwise you pass away in a state where Hajj was fard upon you and you never performed it. Right? So all of these things must be considered. Another thing, when it comes to the shares that are allocated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the shares that are allocated, for many people tend to have this question, or they feel uncomfortable when they see that, for example, just for example's sake, that a son will get double what a daughter will receive. Why is the son's share double the share of the daughter? And people tend to have this kind of negative feeling towards it, that Islam is giving preference to the men, and that the women don't get any money from the share, whatever, etc. Now there are reasons, right? There are plenty of reasons why we can give for why the shares are the way that they are. However, at the end of the day, none of that matters. What matters is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed this for us to distribute our wealth in a certain way. And He even tells us that perhaps you might want to give your daughter more than your son. Maybe your daughter, throughout her life, she served you more, she followed the rules of Islam more, and your son didn't. So why should your son be deserving of a greater share? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. You don't know which one will actually benefit you more in the long run. It's possible that you decide to distribute your wealth the way you want to, but you pass away and then your wealth gets used in a way that you never expected. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and is the most wise. He's the all-knowing and all-wise. So these shares that have been allocated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the best possible solution. Right? There's no room for our own rational judgment here. So I won't go into the specific shares. I think that probably would have been easier if I had a presentation to go down and break it down. But also, this is something that would take very, very long. The field of inheritance, of Islamic inheritance, is something that is taught in Islamic schools and madrasas over the course of an entire year, right? Just to learn who gets what and the different scenarios. So of course, there's only so much we can cover with this short time, so I won't go into that. But the point is that we should all know that this exists, and that when we want to prepare our wills, when we want to get into estate planning, we should be aware that this is how things are, and we need the assistance of a scholar and of a lawyer as well, of an attorney. So what are some considerations that a person should keep when having a will, when creating a will? First of all, you cannot disinherit an heir, right? A person, if a person passes away and they have many children, their children, provided they're all Muslim, are all entitled to their share of inheritance. You cannot say that I only want these kids to inherit, I don't want those kids to inherit. That's not right. Islamically speaking, all of your kids are entitled to their share of inheritance. You cannot favor one heir unjustly after your passing. During your lifetime, sure, if you want to, if one of your kids is very supportive of you and the other one's kind of left you, and you want to give more support to the child who has been taking care of you, that's fine. That's during your lifetime, that's okay. But after your passing, the shares that have been allocated in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's automatic. It doesn't matter if you want it or not. It doesn't matter if you put it in your will or not. Those shares will automatically become the ownership of, Islamically speaking, they will become the ownership of whoever they're supposed to go to. Right? Now, whether you have a will and ensure that legally speaking, that's also the case, that's good. And if you don't have a will and legally speaking, perhaps somebody else is actually the owner, but Islamically speaking, your child or whoever, your heirs are the owner, then you will be responsible for that because you didn't take the proper precautions before passing. Another consideration is the limit of 1/3. 1/3 for bequests. That 1/3 that we have an option to spend however we want, it's limited to 1/3. And why is it limited to 1/3? It is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to ensure that we do leave something behind for our children. You cannot, like I said in the example earlier, the Sahabi radiallahu anhu who wanted to donate all of his wealth into charity, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam stopped him and he said only 1/3, because you need to leave something for your family. Some other considerations are, of course, avoiding riba, avoiding interest, ensuring that there's no interest-based elements within a person's trust. You're not earning interest on whatever assets you put in there. Similarly, when it comes to paying off debts after a person passes away, you want to ensure that those debts are paid off, right? These are interest. If a person has interest-bearing loans, if a person has a mortgage, then you want to ensure that they are paid off as soon as possible. And also, of course, from the spiritual perspective, it's not just about money at the end of the day. It is about securing our akhirah, right? As I mentioned, in the same way that sadaqah jariyah can continue to benefit a person after they pass away, a person's wealth can also continue to harm them after they pass away. So it is about ensuring our own akhirah and ensuring that our life in this world and in the next, as well as our children's lives in this world and the next, and the rest of our heirs, is taken care of. So it is our choice whether our wealth becomes a source of barakah for our families, a source of additional assistance for our families, or if it actually becomes a source of dispute, if it becomes a source of arguments between our families, and if it becomes a source of sin within our families. That's all up to us, and that all can be prevented. Rasulullah ﷺ says in a hadith that I'm sure we are all aware of, that when a person passes away, all of their deeds end except for 3. And I've mentioned this already. One is the sadaqah jariyah. Secondly is if a person has beneficial knowledge, which people continue to benefit from. And the third is if a person leaves behind a righteous child who continues to make dua for them. All 3 of these things can be achieved by having an estate plan. Ongoing charity. If a person wants to put in their wasiyah that part of their wealth should be put towards charity, that is fulfilled by having a will, by having an estate plan. Similarly, having children who make dua for you, by ensuring that your children get the share that they deserve, your children will continue to make dua for you after your passing. Similarly, even knowledge that is beneficial knowledge, knowledge that people continue to benefit from. If a person creates an estate plan and they show others that this is possible, it is possible for you while living in this non-Muslim country to ensure that your wealth gets distributed Islamically. It is possible. That is knowledge that is beneficial, that is benefiting other people as well. And everyone who now creates their own estate plan, creates their own will because of that, you will receive the reward. So all of these things, whether it's financial, whether it's physical in terms of custody and guardianship of children, whether it's spiritual regarding our akhirah, from all different perspectives, there's only positives to having an estate plan. So I don't want to take too much time. I'm not sure, I'm not even sure how much time I was supposed to take. But the point was to show that it's important and it is necessary for all of us to consider these things. It's not something that we should overlook. And also some of the key considerations when it comes to creating things like this, to using these kinds of tools, whether it's a will or whether it's a trust or any other form of estate plan, that we ensure that we are still abiding by the laws of Allah, by the laws of Islam, by the rules set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in ensuring that everyone gets the share that they are supposed to get, and that we are not unjustly favoring one party over another, etc. I'll end off there, and I'll let Sister Amina take over, inshallah. And inshallah, if there's any questions, then we can do that towards the end, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
You will be sitting, right? You could take. Okay. Just the pocket somewhere. And clip on this one.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You will for that incredibly insightful. No.
Jazakallahu khairan to Mufti Adil Sadiq for that incredibly insightful presentation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your dedication to the community and for sharing your expertise with us today. Now, to build upon that foundation of Sharia principles, we will transition to the legal application of these values, inshallah. It is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Sister Amina Rashad, Esquire, and she will be able to talk about the legal aspect. Please be reminded that after her presentation, we will go into question and answer. But before we do that, the brothers would like to set up and prepare in the basement for food. So we would request the brothers, inshallah, to use the chairs so that we can be able to take it downstairs and give us some time, inshallah. So over to Sister Amina, inshallah.
Actually, it might be easier if I sit just because I'll have my laptop. That's fine. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Jazakallah khair to Mufti Adil and Imam Saab for such a beautiful opening. So I want to start off with why the seminar matters, and I believe that Mufti Adil just set this up so beautifully, mashallah. There's two myths that people have that I really want to address, and now this is a test for you because he definitely covered this one. Myth number one is that estate plans are only something for wealthy families. That is obviously untrue. Mufti Adil went over the hadith. It's not permissible for a Muslim to sleep more than 2 nights without having written a will. In addition, another aspect that I like to point out to my clients is that it is addressed in the Quran itself, aside from the Quranic shares, where Allah refers to our wealth, where He says, believe in Allah and His Messenger and spend out of that which Allah has made you successors. And the reason that language is so powerful is because Allah describes us as successors over our wealth. In other words, what we possess is not truly ours. It's an amana, it's a trust placed in us, in our care for a period of time, only to pass into the hands of the next in line. And so this should change how we think about financial planning, but it also explains a little bit about what I do at Amana Legal. And that is, the secular world also has an estate plan. But the way that people do their estate plans in the secular world is, how do I want to distribute my assets after I pass? But for us as Muslims, it's what does Allah want us to do with what He left us as successors over? And so my job as an attorney at Amana Legal is, we live within this broader system of the secular law. How do we create a system within that system that respects and honors our faith and values? And that is absolutely not an easy task because, as Mufti Adil touched upon, Islamic inheritance laws are very complicated. So this is a very well thought out and thoughtful process. It's not something that you can go onto a website, click a few boxes, and something spits out a will at you. I believe Mufti Adil did an excellent job of just highlighting the weight of making sure that this is done properly. And so you certainly want to make sure that you're putting thought into this and not just checking a few boxes and being on your way. Myth number 2 is that you don't have an estate plan. The reality is everybody here has an estate plan. Your estate plan is New York state law. Obviously, New York state law does not comply with the Quranic shares, and that's why it is up to us as Muslims to protect our souls and to draft an Islamic estate plan. Generally speaking, I'm going to start going into the legalities of an estate plan. So let's start with what an estate plan actually is. Oh, is the sound gone? Test. No, I don't think it's working.
Sorry. Yeah, it's working now. Yeah.
Do you want me to just hold the, you want me to use the other one? I can hold it. Yeah. That's fine, thank you. Is it up? What do I do? Okay. Okay. most people, when we talk about estate plans, they think about a will. But the reality is an estate plan is a series of documents that covers various aspects of your life. And you need to think about an estate plan as a timeline. So there's documents that cover what happens during your lifetime. That's a healthcare proxy, which covers in the event that you're not able to make medical decisions for yourself, who makes those medical decisions. A power of attorney, which is identical but relates to your financial decisions. And then there's something called a living will, which again, Mufti Adil touched upon. For lack of a better term, it's called the pull the plug document because it talks about when you would want to be taken off of life support. God forbid if that were ever the case. And then there are the documents that are effective only upon passing. That's your will. And then there's a third category of documents. Those are the documents that are effective during your life, but then also after you pass away. And that's where a trust comes into play. So there's two types of trust, the revocable living trust and the irrevocable trust. The important reason you'll note that I see the revocable trust here turns into an irrevocable trust and moves over after death, and that is when you set up a revocable trust. I'll explain what revocable means, but for now, just understand that when you pass away, your irrevocable trust automatically turns into a irrevocable trust. So now let's get into the details of a trust. There's two types of trusts. There's a revocable trust and an irrevocable trust. A revocable trust is something that you can consider as a container. It's a container, it has a lid, but there's no lock. So you can move things in and out freely. Whatever you put in, you can take out whenever you please. You can put it in during your lifetime, take it out during your lifetime, or you can leave it in for the entirety of your life and deal with it after you pass away. And then there's something called an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a trust that has, as you can see, it has a lock on it. Whatever you put in cannot come out absent very specific circumstances, which ordinarily do involve court involvement. So for the vast majority of people, we do use revocable trust because it allows you flexibility. So many of our families, the largest asset is going to be the family residence, right? And you don't want to put your family residence into an irrevocable trust and now you don't have access to your largest asset, God forbid, you need to be liquid. Or even if you want to sell it and purchase a different property, it just creates a lot more friction and a lot more complications. When we're talking about trust, whether it be revocable or irrevocable, there's going to be three main characters in a trust. One is the grantor, two is the trustee, and three are the beneficiaries. The grantor is you. This is the one who is, you're the one creating this container. You are the one that's deciding what's going to go into the container, how should it be managed. You're the one that is creating the law for inside this container. And you're also deciding who ultimately benefits from what you put in that container. In most estate plans, the grantor is also the person whose assets are being protected and distributed. So in plain English, this means you are the decision maker at the beginning of the trust. Then you have the trustee. This is the person or institution responsible for carrying out your instructions. They are legally bound and required to follow the law that you created for within that container. They're going to manage the assets. They're going to make the distribution based upon the rules that you set out, and they have to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. Choosing a trustee, again, it's not about who you love the most or who your favorite person is. It's about who can handle the responsibility, the money, and the pressure. So essentially, the trustee is the manager that has a legal duty. On a practical term, I just want you all to know, when we do a revocable trust, for example, during your lifetime, you're going to be your trustee. Sometimes we do joint marital trusts, where it's a trust between the husband and the wife, and both of their assets are in there. During the husband and wife's lifetimes, each of them are going to be co-trustees. When one passes away, then the surviving spouse becomes the sole trustee. So you can be in a revocable trust, you can be the trustee of your own trust. Third are the beneficiaries. These are the people that are going to benefit and inherit from the trust itself. Why do we use trusts? We use trusts for control, structure, and protection. From an Islamic inheritance perspective, I will tell you why the vast majority of my Islamic estate plans The vast majority of my estate plans for Muslim clients when we're doing Quranic inheritance is going to be trust-based, which means that we use a revocable trust. There's a few reasons for that. One is that it allows us greater flexibility. So we can't escape the fact that we do live in the West, right? But that doesn't mean that we ignore the obligations that we have to Allah. But Allah gave us, like subhanAllah, like Islam is such an amazing religion because no matter what place or what time you're in, Allah has given us the tools to allow us to obey Him. So it's one of those things where you say, like Jannah is like ours to lose, right? Like this is ours to lose because we can draft. I have drafted like 150-page trust documents where ordinarily a secular trust is 25 pages. Because there's concerns that people have, right? You know, a husband may worry that if the only asset is the house, if the wife is going to get, for example, I'm using this number as an example, nobody hold me to it, 1/8, when he passes away, that eighth, like she's entitled to that the minute he passes away. That interest vests at that minute. Likewise, the children's interest. So when the son inherits twice the share of the sisters, etc., all of those beneficiaries have a right to that inheritance the minute the father passes away. So how do we make sure that the wife who survived keeps a roof over her head, right? That's a very real concern because we don't live in a society where when someone becomes widowed, there's a line of people to take care of her. We just don't live in that world anymore. And so these are concerns that people have, and I work with scholars to make sure that whatever we draft is going to be proper. I take very seriously because, and I think Mufti Adil just scared the lights out of me, in terms of this is the last deed that you are doing on earth. And if I am representing that I'm putting something forward that's Sharia compliant and that you are fulfilling your obligation to Allah, ultimately that obligation falls on me too, right? So it is a terrifying position to be in, and for that reason, every step of the way, I will show the documents to scholars. I'll make sure, okay, this is this family's particular situation. This is a very unique concern that they have. Is there a way for us to address this? And I've had many of those conversations. I don't think it's appropriate for me to share the different ways that we address these issues in a larger room. But inshallah, if anybody wants to discuss, I'm always happy to discuss some of the solutions we've come up with. That doesn't mean we look for loopholes. That's not what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that we find a way out to give our daughters the same as our sons. No, that's not what we're doing. But the point is that there are very real concerns that we have in the West, and there is a way, and Allah provided a way for us to address them. Oh, I'm going backwards. I'm sorry. All right, irrevocable trusts. So I touched on irrevocable trusts. They are the lockdown, no flexibility version of the trust. I did say that I usually do revocable trusts in my estate plan. There are very specific situations where we do irrevocable trusts. One is for Medicaid planning. And that is a huge concern for our community as well, right? So with Medicaid planning, when someone is seeking to qualify for long-term care in their elder years, Medicaid, in order to be approved, they will look at your assets and what you own in order to qualify you. So when we're doing a Medicaid planning trust, the purpose of that trust is to move the assets out of what we call the person's estate, quote unquote, because now those assets are no longer counted as their personal assets, and it won't prevent qualification for Medicaid. The reason that this is, so I'm trying not to be too technical, but one of the main differences between a revocable and irrevocable trust is whether you still have control over the assets. So if you are going to tell, for example, a government agency that this should not be counted as an asset you own, then for all intents and purposes, you can't actually have control over it, right? You shouldn't be able to reach back into the container and take it out. You shouldn't be able to sell it. You shouldn't be able to benefit from what's inside there. So that is why we do Medicaid planning trust. They do have a 5-year look-back period, and what that means is that anything that you transferred within the last 5 years will be counted against you in terms of qualification. So this is where planning really comes into play, right? Of course, we can only plan so much, but as we age, it is something to think about. At some point, if there's a need, God forbid, for long-term care, maybe there are some assets that can be moved into an irrevocable trust and therefore not create obstacles when it comes time to get approval. The second situation is special needs. So many people in our community do have special needs children. Likewise, that's a concern for parents of special needs children because those special needs children, they have a right to inherit from their parents Islamically, but the problem is that if they inherit Islamically, that will disqualify them immediately from a lot of the benefits that they're receiving. And so we put their inheritance into an irrevocable trust. It's called a special needs trust. It can be used for the benefit of the special needs child or special needs adult in terms of their day-to-day care, but it will not disqualify them from some of the public benefits that they're receiving. Financial authority during your lifetime, that is your power of attorney. So this is the other document that I was discussing is effective during your lifetime. So God forbid you are not able to make decisions. Who's going to make those decisions for you? God forbid you're not able, if you're incapacitated, God forbid, how does your family get the money out of the bank account to pay for the mortgage or pay the utility bills, right? That's why you want to have this in place. And one of the most important things to keep in mind about powers of attorney, sometimes people think, oh, I'll get to it later, right? There is a legal requirement for a power of attorney to be valid, and that is that the principal, meaning you, the one that's giving the power, needs to have capacity at the time that you signed it. Once, God forbid, something happens and you lack capacity, you can't execute a valid power of attorney. So now it's too late. Again, this is where planning comes into play. You make sure you have all of these things in place beforehand. God forbid we ever need them, it's in place. There's going to be two main characters in the power of attorney. The principal, that's you, and then the agent, and that is the person that you appoint. I am very risk averse personally in my practice, and I always tell everybody the power of attorney is the single strongest legal document from my experience on the planet. It allows the person that you appoint as an agent to literally step in your place. They can sell your house depending on the powers you grant. They can empty out your bank accounts. They can do anything. And I'm hesitant to allow a document like that just to be floating around, right? When you don't need it. And so my goal in my office, usually what I tell people is I have the principal, I have you sign, and then I keep it in my office so that if it's needed, God forbid, the agent comes in and they sign it. Once they sign it, it becomes effective. Your power of attorney is not effective until the agent signs it as well. And so in that way, if you make your wife angry, she can't go and sell everything off because it is not an effective power of attorney until it is fully signed and I hold on to the partially executed document. The last is the will. This is what everybody thinks about when they're talking about estate planning. Wills have three main players. They have the testator, executor, and beneficiaries. You'll notice when I go through these that it seems very parallel to the main players that we talked about in a trust. Testator's you, just like you're the grantor in the will. You're the one making the will. You're deciding what happens to your assets, who gets what, and who you trust to carry this out. This is your voice. It's written down, and it's followed even when you're not here. Executor, this is akin to the trustee. In the trust, this is the person you appoint in your will to carry out the instructions after you pass. They're responsible for handling finances, paying off debts, and distributing assets. And then there's the beneficiary, spouse, children, discretionary shares. One of the things I want to make clear is that you can do an Islamic estate plan without a trust. We just would put when I do an Islamic will, it's very long also because we have the entire schedule for who's inheriting in the will, and as Mufti Adil touched on, it's just so precise in terms of who's alive at the time that you pass. So we need to have that entire schedule in there. It's not enough in the US to say, I want my assets distributed Islamically, because the court is not, by the Constitution, we all have a right to distribute our assets as we wish, even if that's in accordance with Islam. But the courts are restricted by the Constitution to interpret what that means. So the court can't interpret what does Islamic law mean. The court can't interpret what are Quranic shares. Nobody can do that. And so that's why everything needs to be spelled out. For parents of minor children, your will is also the place where you appoint a guardian. And one of the things I work at this point for 12 years, I've been in family court. And so I've witnessed a lot of what happens when people don't have guardianship in place. And one of, I think the most distressing things that I witnessed was that a mom passed away. She got in a car accident in the middle of the day. It was like a Tuesday. And the social workers in school had to go and tell these two teenage daughters that their mom had passed away in the middle of the day on a Tuesday. So on Tuesday, the mom passed away. They got taken home. There was some random family member, like the two sides, the mom's side and the dad's side, started fighting over the children. The dad was in a foreign country, so he didn't have access to these children. So these children got moved overnight from their home in New Jersey, their friends in New Jersey, their school district, to Long Island. And now they were embroiled in legal proceedings in family court, meeting with lawyers and coming to court, all because there is no guardianship designation. So imagine the most traumatic part, and the most traumatic thing a child can go through, and now in the middle of going through all of that, there's like a tug of war over these children. Why? Because the children are going to inherit, right? And these are just very real things that wind up happening when people pass away. So arguably, I would say for parents, our children have a right over us that we make sure that they will be taken care of. And just to point out that even if you appoint a guardian, right, you appoint your guardian in your will, it's not an automatic thing. It still has to be processed through family court. But in the meantime, while those paperwork, while everything's going through, the children are with you. And it creates less of a chance of a fight because the court is just not going to entertain frivolous claims for guardianship when there's already a guardianship designation in place. The healthcare proxy I discussed earlier. This is going to be the document that details who makes decisions for you in the event that you're unable to. In my healthcare proxies, I tend to also put wishes with respect to burial and things like that. So all of these documents are tailored to fit an Islamic estate plan. This is my contact information, but before I wrap up, I do want to discuss one of the things that come into play, and I hope that Mufti Adil can provide some insight on this because I think he's, mashallah, such an excellent resource. So when people come to me to do their estate plans, usually the absolute largest asset in that estate plan is going to be their home. And as you can imagine, we are like turning ourselves into pretzels, trying to make sure that we do this properly Islamically, and then we get to the end and we find out that the home is in an interest-bearing mortgage, right? And so that becomes a huge obstacle because, as Mufti Adil touched on, if we're doing an Islamic estate plan, every component of that estate plan, in order for it to be Sharia compliant, needs to be proper. And having interest-based loans within that estate plan becomes problematic. And so I have this conversation with clients all the time, right? They need to refinance. If you have a conventional loan, you need to refinance. Alhamdulillah, we have so many options now for financing. But I don't mean to put you on the spot, I'm sorry. Can I pass this? So I just wanted to address some of the questions that I get from clients, since you are well-versed. Some of the questions I get from clients. So sometimes people say to me, it's the same thing. Like, what's different? Because you're just calling it profit, you're not calling it interest. So what's the difference?
Sure, and I think this is a question that I mean, probably majority of the people in this room even have, is that what is Islamic finance? To me, it all just seems the same. You're just replacing the word interest with profit. At the end of the day, you're still charging the same rate. Maybe you're even charging more. So how could that be Islamic? Right? This is a question that so many people have. Now, while I will say that there are institutions out there who perhaps claim to be Islamic and are not really, right? That is definitely an issue that we have and that we need to be careful of. That being said, we also have institutions who went through every single possible difficult, they went through every single thing that they possibly could do to ensure that they are actually truly Sharia compliant. You know, when it comes to discussing it with scholars, getting approved by scholars, discussing it with lawyers. Some institutions, and I don't want to take any names, but some institutions have put in years and years of money and resources, research and development into ensuring that their product that they come out with at the end is actually halal, is actually Sharia compliant. So you can imagine how it feels when people put millions of dollars, years and years of their life into ensuring that they want to provide Muslims with a halal alternative. And what do they get in return? They get spit at saying that you're just lying, you're just trying to make money from the Muslims, and it's all fake, it's all the same. So if we really had to break it down, what is the main difference between an Islamic mortgage and a conventional mortgage? An Islamic mortgage can take any number of forms, depending on which Islamic contract is used. Without getting into too much detail, the main contract that is used in Islamic mortgages is called a diminishing musharaka, or a musharaka mutanaqisa, which means declining co-ownership. What does that mean? That means that you are not getting a loan. As you would from a bank, when you want to buy a house, you get a loan from the bank and then you pay interest on the loan, right? That everyone understands how that works, right? From an Islamic institution, you're not getting a loan to begin with. An Islamic institution will never put money in your hands, okay? If you're not getting a loan from an Islamic institution, what are you getting? You're getting a partner, you're getting an investor, you're getting someone, an institution or a person, whatever, who is willing to buy this property with you as a co-owner, as a partner. So when you're purchasing a house, you're making a down payment, you make a 10%, 20% down payment, you now become 10%, 20% owner of that home, and the institution will cover the remaining cost, right? That's same as a bank. A bank will cover the remaining cost, but what's the difference here? A bank covers the remaining cost how? By giving you that money as a loan, and then charging you interest on that loan. How does an Islamic institution cover the remaining cost? They don't give you any money. They don't give you any loan. Instead, they directly purchase the home with you. As a buyer of that property, they become a co-owner of that property with you. Then over time, they sell their share to you, right? Until you become 100% owner. So as you can see, there's no loan to begin with. Hence, it's simply not possible for there to be interest. So when people say, oh, it's all the same, you're just changing the word interest into profit, that doesn't even make sense because there is no loan for there to be interest. Right? What is interest? What is riba? What is haram? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam have told us that a person who engages in interest is engaging in war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what is interest? What is riba? Riba is, at the very basic definition, there's plenty of definitions out there, but at the very basic definition, it is when you give a loan to someone and you take back extra. I gave you a $100,000 loan and I told you owe me $110,000. That is interest, that is riba. If I never gave you money to begin with, how can I be charging you interest? What am I charging you interest on? Right? So does that make sense? So that is why there's a clear difference between the two. Now before I pass it off.
I want to jump in because I just have one follow-up. And
sure.
I always tell, and I've had conversations with others, like you and I have had a conversation about this as well.
Yeah.
So there's so many things that make sense to me about it, and then there's sometimes like one piece that doesn't make sense to me. Mm-hmm. So from a legal perspective, it makes sense to me because if I buy a home with you and I tell you I'm going to live in this home alone, you don't get to live here, right? And if you own 80% of it, then it's reasonable for me to pay you something to exclude you from that home, right? So that piece of the profit, I can understand that. I think my the one thing that doesn't necessarily make sense to me is the if there's, because you need to share the risk, right? But like how does an Islamic finance company share the risk if ultimately, God forbid, if there's a tornado or something, like how do they share that risk? Because they still are owed their money, and so what happens?
Yep. So again, this varies from institution to institution. Not all institutions are the same, which is why it is really important before going forward with any institution that you actually review their contracts with the scholar and you see who is on their Sharia board and who actually approved this product, because I mean as I said, there are plenty of institutions out there who do have that Islamic label, but they are not actually Islamic, right? Which contributes to why there's so much widespread skepticism. So now specifically regarding this this question, risk sharing, right? This is one of the key components of Islamic finance. And what makes it different from a conventional loan. In a conventional loan, regardless of what happens to the house, the bank doesn't care, right? The bank just wants their money. They have no ownership interest in that house. They'll take the house as a collateral, as a security against the debt, right? So anyone who has a mortgage would know that the house is taken as collateral. However, they do not actually have any ownership in that house, and they don't have any interest in what happens to that house. Their main concern is just getting their money at the end of the day. The difference between that and an Islamic institution is that they are actually co-owners of the property, meaning any damage that happens to that property, that is damage to them as well. Or it should be, at least, right? Because if you guys are co-owners of a property, if a person owns 20% and this institution owns 80%, 80% of the loss, if let's say there's, as you said, if there's a tornado, something that is out of everyone's control, you have homeowners insurance, sure, the insurance payout, how do you split that insurance payout now? So Islamically speaking, that insurance payout that you receive, if something were to, God forbid, happen to the home, should be split according to your ownership in that property. Let's say you have, just hypothetical, just throwing numbers out there, you have a $100,000 home and it gets destroyed by a tornado. And then insurance, because that was nobody's fault, insurance will then give you a payout. Insurance pays you out $100,000, the value of the home. How is that $100,000 going to then, do you keep all of that $100,000? Will the institution keep the whole $100,000? Because technically you owe them, right? You have a contract with them that you were going to buy them. Will they then take that whole $100,000 and say, you owe us, so we're just going to take it? Islamically speaking, no. Islamically speaking, that $100,000 that you get from insurance should be split according to your ownership in the property. So if you are 20% owner, you will get 20% share of that insurance payout. And the institution that you financed from, they are, in this example, 80% owner of the house. They will receive 80% of that insurance payout. And some institutions will have this in their contract, that if there is any such situation, eminent domain, where the property gets destroyed, whatever the insurance payout is will be split pro rata, meaning according to your ownership in the property. At the same time, you have other institutions who have the exact opposite. Even though they're Islamic institutions, they might have it in their contract that if there is an insurance payout, we, the institution, will first secure our share, and if there is anything left over, then the customer will get the leftover. And that is unfortunately not Islamic. So like I said, we have a number of institutions out there, and I'm specifically refraining from taking any names, right? However, we have institutions out there who do it the right way, and we also have institutions who do it the wrong way. So it's important for all of us here to ensure that wherever, if we want, which we all should, if we go towards an Islamic mortgage, towards Islamic finance for whatever reason, that we ensure that we're actually doing it the right way, right? And regardless, at the end of the day, one of the things that I hear all the time, which unfortunately just makes me very sad, is people who say, oh, it's all the same, might as well go conventional, you'll get a cheaper rate. So regardless of whether it's fully Islamic or whether they might have some issues here and there, at the very least we can accept that an attempt at being Islamic is better than full-on going conventional, right? At least you're trying. At least you can tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you've tried, right? Rather than just saying, oh, it's all the same, I'd rather save some money. No, at least you could say that you tried to go Islamic, that you tried to do it in the halal way. Right? That's one of the biggest things that I hear that just makes me really sad, when people don't attach that same level of hate towards sin, that level of hate towards sin that we're supposed to have. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a dua in the Quran, Allahumma habbib ilayna al-iman wa zayyinhu fi qulubina wa karrih ilayna al-kufra wal-fusuqa wal-isyan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make sins disliked towards us so that we don't even want to commit them. So we see people, if you see, for example, if you see a person walking into a bar, a Muslim person walking into a bar, you would automatically in your mind, you might think, oh, this person, whatever, they're engaging in something haram, and you look down on that person. Of course, we shouldn't judge anybody, but the point is we look down on the sin, right? If we catch a Muslim doing something sinful, then we look down on that sin. How many Muslims do we know within our own families and among our close friends that are engaged in interest and in riba and have interest-bearing mortgages on their homes and have student loans and this, but have we ever even thought in our mind that, oh, this is actually something haram that they're doing and that we should look down on this and we shouldn't support this? No. For some reason, in our minds, interest is not as big of a sin as drinking alcohol or zina, for some reason. Despite the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, this is the only sin in the Quran which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He wages war against that person. So it's really interesting how we've kind of twisted up in our minds where we consider some sins to be worse than others, and some sins are okay. Oh, we're in the US, it's okay. You're allowed to buy the first house on interest because it's a necessity. We diminish the level of this sin in our minds and in our eyes. Whereas in reality, it is one of the greatest, one of the biggest sins that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has explicitly said that He is waging war against that person. So we really just need to, it's a mindset shift, a perspective change that I think we all need to have, rather than just being skeptical about everything and thinking that, oh, it's Islamic, they're just trying to make money out of me, it's not actually Islamic. I mean, these are your fellow Muslim brothers and sisters who are trying to save you from haram. And instead of taking that assistance, you turn around and say that they're fake. It's very, it's something that we all need to think about and consider ourselves.
How are you going to buy a house if you don't take a loan?
Exactly, so that's what I'm saying. So you can, that comes down to the whole thing, the whole process, yeah. Sure. Okay, yeah, you can go ahead.
Can we take some questions?
Yes. We're going to do that now, inshallah. Firstly, I would like to say Jazakallahu Khair to Sister Amina Rashad Esquire for that incredibly practical and enlightening presentation. And, it is one thing to know our religious obligations, but it is another to understand how to protect them within the U.S. legal system. And so may Allah continue to bless both of our speakers for your time and wisdom, and may He make this knowledge a means of protection and barakah for our families and our community. Before we move into Q&A, we would like to prepare for lunch downstairs in the basement, so we would like to kindly request the brothers to stand so that we can be able to take the chairs in the basement, inshallah. You can occupy the floor, you can sit comfortably on the floor, inshallah, and we will begin the Q&A, inshallah. So the brothers will start to take the chairs from you.
While they're transitioning, I forgot to explain, in terms of the workbook.
Okay.
There are areas in the workbook for you to track down, like prayers that you've missed, zakat, hajj, etc. And it's something you want to take the time. There's a lot more detail in the book. You can work through it. In the back, you do receive $250 off any estate plan or anything. So what I recommend for anyone that's interested is definitely go through the workbook, fill it out, and then if you're interested in consulting, anyone that's at this event will have a free consultation, and then we can go through the workbook together and figure out what a good direction is for your estate plan, okay?
One question.
Sure.
About the ChatGPT being freedom of information, my son's going to get there, my daughter's going to get there. We did that already. What is the difference between these? And can you clarify distinction between this one and the one you are talking about?
When you say this one, you mean New York?
Like a ChatGPT, we just made a wheel right here. It costs $59.
Did you say ChatGPT?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Don't use ChatGPT.
Okay, we'll give the mic to brothers so they can ask you questions, sure. Brothers, you can just give the chairs, but you can sit down. You can sit down, please. We just need the chairs to take it to the basement so they can set up around the tables, but you can please sit down for question and answer, please. Jazakallah khair. Okay, any questions? Okay, let me, he asked first. Yes.
To both of you.
Okay.
Thank you to both of you for beautiful programs. I personally was overwhelmed and was deep inside the conversation. All of a sudden, you moved the whole thing.
Yeah.
From trust, estate planning, wills, wasiya, we went down to banking,
Yes.
interest and profit, which was not the way it was supposed to be. But anyway, now the thing is, my question is here, if it is already ordained or decreed in Quran about the inheritance, now you are making the plan. I had two specific questions. One, what you said, Medicaid, and the other planning, and the inheritance. Now what Brother Adil was saying, that 1/3, you cannot donate more than 1/3. I don't know if I heard him right or not. Okay, because the inheritance, your children deserves more than what, it has to be within the 2/3. So can you go details in there also? Because say for example, I have a trust, I listen to you. To tell you the truth, I don't see any difference between the trust I made according to New York State law. Definitely, we know Islamic law, so we told the attorneys to make it that way.
Yeah.
But basically, it's the same. So what would be the difference in Islamic Sharia law trust and the regular trust, the guided by the New York State and the federal government? Is there any difference in there?
There is, because
And I would like to also answer in there the ratio of son. He was just pointing, but he did not stay for more than 15 seconds. The son would get 2, daughter will get 1, but we want that thing. Specifically, how much we will distribute our wealth to our children. So could you please emphasize on that?
so the difference between, if I understand your question correctly, a regular trust that you draft, of course, is that you have freedom to distribute whatever you want to whomever you want. And a Sharia compliant trust, and I think you mentioned that you had somebody draft according to shares, right? According to Quranic shares. Now, here's my,
I got an Islamic Sharia trust. I got a regular attorney, they made it.
okay.
So, but I don't see any difference between the Sharia trust and their trust.
The difference is that, so I'm not sure, are you saying that you had an attorney draft a trust that has Quranic shares in it, and what's the difference between that and what I'm saying?
It doesn't mention Quranic or anything. The law, the estate, like if anybody goes to make a trust, we made a trust. I think a lot of other brothers also made a trust. But there is no difference between what you are explaining here and their trust.
Are you saying that it's a trust where you told them give twice the shares to my sons than my daughters? Is that what you're saying?
No, all those are living will.
So the difference is the distributions, right? Because so if you have, say for example, you're telling me I went to an attorney and I had them say put in the Islamic distributions, right? If that's what you're saying. Now here's the issue, right? Did the person think about the distributions when your son inherits if he's a minor, okay? If he's baligh, but he's a minor, right? He's mature according to Islam, but he's a minor according to New York. The minute you pass away, he has a right to take that money. So
it is like, say for example, myself, I have 3 kids, 2 daughters, 1 son.
yes,
How I will distribute the inheritance? That is like,
you're asking me what the breakdown,
what would be the Sharia?
that's for him.
In there I can distribute, both of you.
Yeah,
I think the equal.
I'll answer.
I'm sorry for the interruption here. The question Dr. Bojan is asking should be asking to you, because I think mixing the wills and the trust. He is here to take the will and she is here to make the trust. The only thing I understand from these two people, they're combining so he can provide the Islamic knowledge of the wills which can come under the trust. So this trust which they are talking about, just to make sure if it is compliance with the Sharia law, and that's why Sheikh Adil is here. Okay,
So-
this is my understanding. They know better.
I'm going to add one thing before, because Mufti Adil is in a much better position to say what the distributions are. But the difference also, generally speaking, is that when I say that there's 125 pages in the trust, the reason is because Islamically there's an issue. The issue is that your minor child has a right to his money the minute you pass away. Whereas under US law, they don't get their money until 18. So how do you bridge that gap? Because technically you're taking a right away from a child. If they're baligh, right, they have a right to their money right away. So the difference, one aspect of an Islamic trust is you are going to think about all of these things that can happen, that can take your good intentions and make it not compliant with Islamic law. And those things need to be addressed. But I'll turn it to Mufti Adil in terms of what the shares are.
Sure. So
Okay,
I understand
I
your
just
question.
wanted to point out one thing. We can have another program, inshallah, which we are planning already. Here we're going to have one question, one brother, brief, and we'll go on, inshallah. So, but we're going to have another program, inshallah. We are planning.
Yeah. So
And also, please, if we can respect the speakers who are here in just one question, inshallah, allow them to answer so that we can also rotate it for others who have questions as well. So one question, allow him to answer or her, and we can be able to follow up with your other questions when your turn comes, inshallah. No problem. We'll continue after, inshallah.
Okay. Yes, so as you mentioned, I did touch on it a little bit briefly, but I didn't go into the specifics about the shares because, like I said, that would get extremely complicated and it would take a very long time. But just to answer your question, in this case, if you have, I believe you said 2 daughters and 1 son, right? Even with that much information, I can't give you an answer. Because everyone's situation is different. If a person has 2 daughters and 1 son, I still have to see, okay, are you married? Do you have a wife? Do you have any siblings? Are your parents alive? All of those things will make a difference into who gets how much, right? So that's why for every single person, it's not simply enough for you to say that, oh, for example, each son should get double the amount of a daughter, for example, right? That's not sufficient because all your other relatives who are alive also have to be taken into account. Right, and this requires you to sit down with a scholar and tell that person, okay, I have 3 kids, I have a wife, I have my parents who are alive, I have these siblings. These are everyone who has potential to inherit from me. Now, Islamically speaking, who actually inherits from me, right? So it would be different for every single case. So just with that information that you gave me, that you have 3 kids, 2 daughters, 1 son, the most I can tell you is that the son will get double the amount of each daughter. That's from Quranic shares. However, what is that amount? Is it, for example, if the son gets half, then each daughter gets a quarter, right? Is that correct? Not necessarily, because what if you have a wife? We forgot about your wife. What about your parents? We forgot about your parents. What if you have grandkids? So all of those things are taken into account when determining the shares for each of your inheritors, for each of your heirs. So that's specifically why I skipped that part, because if we wanted to get into specifics, if you're married, this much. If you're not married, this much. If you have 1 kid, this much. If you have 2 kids, this much. If you have 2 daughters, this much. If you have 3 daughters, this much. We could go on and on for hours, right? So that's why it's so important, as Sister Amina was saying, that.
For example,
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, no, Islamically speaking, there's no order. It's all immediate. Your wife and your kids will inherit from you at the same time. Okay. That's why it's important to have an Islamic will versus a conventional
Okay,
trust.
Jazakallah khair. I have a question from brothers and sisters. Any sisters, any questions, sisters? Yeah. Okay. Okay, he asked first.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Walaikum salam.
I got the guidance residential back in 2019.
Okay.
I was not honestly convinced at that time.
Sure.
So only the one thing, the convincing was the 6 muftis signed on one page, the fatwa that is called fatwa.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not convinced at that time. So I asked my dad. So he said, if the 6 muftis, the big muftis from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from America, so if they sign it, so you are good. They are responsible. I am not responsible.
Right.
So the mortgagee bank, guidance residential, the only one thing I asked them, what is the difference between the interest and the share? He said, you know what, this is not interest. This is just a rent.
Yep.
This is a rent. So I'm asking you, sir, this is just a rent, right? So if this is just a rent, so I got in 2019, that was 4.5%. And then 2021, because of the COVID, I refinanced with guidance with 2.75%.
Okay.
Right? So rent's supposed to be reduced.
Sure.
But the market rate of the rent is increased.
Okay.
In the market rate, the rent increased in the COVID period. So how you can justify? Second thing, sorry sir.
Okay.
So second thing is, if you are taking the benefit of the property, the reimbursement after the house caught fire, with the 80-20%, like for example, I paid only 20% and banks still have 80%, right? So why not the mortgagee, the guidance residential, is responsible for the property tax as well? So the property tax I am paying,
Yep.
but 100%. So why you are not paying my property tax?
Sure,
At
sure.
the time of getting reimbursement, you come after me like, you know what, you understand my point,
Sure,
right?
I understand the question. Okay, let me answer the first question first. And again, I want to refrain from talking about any specific institutions because I don't want this to become like this institution versus that institution. I don't want to get into that. But just in your specific situation, in this model that we discussed earlier, the co-ownership model, right? Where you and, in this case, Guidance, are co-owners of this property. So now, for example's sake, you're 20% owner, Guidance is 80% owner. You are using 100% of the property, right? Guidance is not touching the property. They're 80% owner, but they're not touching the property. You're the one living there. You're the one with your family there. You have full right to do whatever you want with the property. For all intents and purposes, it's essentially yours. It's as if you're 100% owner, but on the paperwork, Guidance is 80% owner. And Guidance will allow you to use, or whatever institution will allow you to use the property as if you're 100% owner. However, in doing so, like you said, you pay a fee to the institution as rent, right? Rent in the sense that you are using something that doesn't belong to you, right? In the regular, if you go and rent an apartment, you don't own that apartment. You are paying rent because you're using that apartment, but somebody else owns it, right? So you're paying them a fee, a rental, for using somebody else's property. So in the same way, if you are 20% owner of a property and whatever institution is 80% owner of the property, you are using their share of the property. So you will pay them a fee for using their share. Whether you call that rent or whether you call that a fee doesn't really matter what you call it. At the end of the day, you're using someone else's property and you're paying them for it. The issue that you're having is you're calling it rent. You can call it rent because essentially it's like rent, right? In the sense that you're using a property that doesn't belong to you. So it's like rent in that sense. However, the issue with calling it rent is exactly the issue that you're saying. During COVID, rent should have increased, but you were given a lower rate, right? For example, right? So in reality, if the institution were to calculate it as rent, your monthly payment would be way higher, right? Way higher. You would have your monthly mortgage plus, for example, let's say you have a single family home, 2-3 bedrooms, whatever. You have your monthly mortgage, right? Meaning you're paying the institution to buy their share. That's one cost. And then on top of that, you're paying rent for using 80% of the property. That rent would not be anywhere less than $3,000-$4,000 a month. How much are they actually charging you in rent? Maybe $100, $200, right? So that's why I was saying using the word rent is a bit misleading because then you'll be like, oh, but the rental market went up, why is my rate so low? Or the rental market went down, why is my rate so high? Because it's not calculated based on that. You may call it rent, but if we were actually to do the calculations as if it was a rental property, your monthly payment would be double, triple what it is, right? So Islamically speaking, from the Islamic perspective, it is classified as rent because Islamically speaking, if you're using a property that you don't own and you're paying someone for using that property, that is considered to be rent, right? But when you use the term rent in like a Western context in the US, then that automatically comes with some other things like, oh, but according to the market, the rent should be this amount, so how come it's actually this amount? That's why we refrain from using the word rent and instead we use the term usage fee or utilization fee. Whereas in reality, it all comes back down to the same thing, which is you're paying someone for using their property. Does that answer your question about, so the rent, right? Like my point was that whatever the rental market is, whatever the rental standard is, that does not affect your whatever rate or whatever rent you're paying to the institution because they're not calculating it on the basis of rent. Right? They're calculating it on some other completely other terms, right? Based on whatever the market mortgage standard is or whatever. They're not calculating it assuming that it's rent, even if Islamically speaking, we do consider it to be rent. So that's why, like I was saying, I refrain from using the word rent because then it gives that other meaning. But in reality, it's not tied to the rental market at all. And if it was, then your monthly payment would be much, much higher. If it was, right? That's the first. I think you had two questions, right?
average cost of a trust, is it depends on the amount or varies?
So I just do flat fees because I think it becomes very unaffordable as a community. If ordinarily as an attorney, so when I'm doing like family law or litigation cases, I charge hourly. Estate plans take such a long time between the coordination with the muftis and back and forth with the families that if I were to charge hourly, nobody would be able to afford it. And given that it is an obligation on us, I think it's just better we just charge flat fees. So I'll share the fees here. I know everyone's gonna get scared. So a trust-based plan for a couple, so husband and wife trust, it's a total of between 9 to 10 documents, is a flat fee of $5,000. And that includes everything beginning to end, full service. There are people, as much as they would like to have a trust, it's just not affordable for them, so we do a will-based plan. And like I said, a will-based plan, you can still do it properly, it's not the gold standard, right? But we can still do it. When you do a will-based plan, again, for husband and wife, it's going to be 8 documents, and that is $3,500.
Thank you.
No problem. If you're moving more than one asset into, yes, because my point, what I'm doing is I'm creating the container, right? After that, whatever assets, whether it's your retirement accounts, whether it is bank accounts, homes, rental properties, whatever you're moving in, that happens after the entire estate plan is completed. So generally speaking, when you're transferring property into a trust, it's going to be through a transfer of deed. So there's going to be the first house, your primary residence. I include that in the $5,000 in terms of my fees for creating the deed. The filing fees to the county, you have to pay the filing fees to the county. That doesn't come to me, that just has to be paid, and that depends which county you live in. Nassau County, unfortunately, is the most expensive with filing fees. I think in Queens, it's somewhere around $300. Nassau County, I think, is close to $1,100 that you have to pay the county. After the first home, I'll give a reduced fee on the deed preparation, and then you have to keep paying the county every time you transfer. But yeah.
Okay, sister has a question, I think.
Hey, assalamu alaikum. Hey, Mina. Actually, it was a follow-up question to the utilization fee with the Islamic financing. You said it was like a utilization fee paid to use the property, but you mentioned earlier something about like declining ownership. So is that like a utilization fee until you pay off the rest of the 80%? Am I?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, sorry. But yeah, so essentially it's a declining co-ownership, right? So your monthly payment to the institution would consist of 2 parts. Part of it is towards increasing your own share, which is where the declining co-ownership comes in. The share of the institution will decrease over time as you continue to buy them out more. That's just part of your monthly payment. The other part of your monthly payment is that utilization fee. So until they are completely bought out, you are using a portion of their property, and for that you continue to pay a utilization fee until you are 100% owner and they're completely bought out, and then you no longer pay that. I mean, you're no longer paying them anything anymore because you're 100% owner now. There's nothing left to pay them.
Yeah, brothers and sisters, I'm sure that everyone has a lot of questions about mortgage and estate planning. We're going to have another program, inshallah. The food is ready. So I think I'll request Sheikh to please wind up, inshallah.
Can I ask a very brief question? Very brief to the sisters. During my lifetime, if I'm going to try to, give away my property to my kids and my wife, is it possible? During my lifetime,
Okay.
it is possible I can give away my property and assets.
I think what you're asking is during your lifetime, can you just transfer what you want to whomever you want? So the very easy question is yes, but there's always a caveat when you ask lawyers, so there's no such thing as a short question. But there can be tax consequences, right? So I'll keep it so simple. When you purchase a home, there's something called a cost basis for you, right? So if I purchase my home today, my cost basis, say, is $400,000. If I sell it, say 10 years from now, and now it's $600,000, I pay capital gains on $200,000 because that's my gain based on my cost basis, meaning what it cost me to get it versus what I'm selling it for. When you give a gift, the person, so if you give your gift to your child, for example, say you give your house to your daughter, when you give it during your lifetime, she takes your cost basis, meaning her basis is going to be 400,000. And then she's going to pay capital gains on the entire amount. Say she sells it later, she's going to pay, say she sells it, it's 900,000, she's going to pay capital gains tax on the 500,000. If she inherits it, her cost basis becomes the cost of the home at the time that she received it, meaning at the time that you pass away. So if the house is $900,000 and then she sells it a year later, she doesn't pay taxes on $500,000 worth of capital gains. So sometimes it seems like a very straightforward, like let me just give it now and then I don't have to worry about twice the share and this and that. But there's tax consequences. So that's not to say that you shouldn't do it. It depends on the family. That's where we sit down and we do the math and we figure out the goals. Like, you know, there's people, sometimes there's a divorced daughter or there's a daughter that may have more. And so as a family, they decide, let's take care of our daughter in such and such way during our lifetime. And then the inheritance will still be according to Quranic shares. And just one last note on that is, I think, obviously you can speak to Mufti Adil afterwards, but we still have to be just with our children, right? So we can't do the loophole thing where we just, I'm just going to give everything to this child in my lifetime because then when I pass away, there's no inheritance left, right? Because at the end of the day, like, are we committing an injustice against anybody else? So, of course, always our intentions and what our intent is. I think there is an appropriate way to do it, but we have to take tax consequences into consideration. Yeah.
Okay. Inshallah, I would like to thank Sister Amina from Amana Legal for being here, and I want to thank Mufti Adil for your time as well. This would not be possible for me to close without thanking the volunteers who have worked very hard to make this a possible program. We want to thank the brother side led by Brother Kaleem and the sister side led by Sister Yusra. And we would also like to thank all of you for coming. Subhanaka Allahumma bihamdik wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant wa nastaghfiruk wa natubu ilayk. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursalin. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Yeah, brothers, please let the sisters go first, please. Yeah, the sisters can go to the other side and use the back door, please. Yeah, brothers can proceed to the basement from here, please.
So he has 4 documents, you have 4 documents, right? If you want to do a will, not a trust. So there's 8 documents total. So total for both you and your husband together is 35.
Yes, we have.
No, not 25. I wish 25,000. 3,500.
Sisters, please go outside and use the door in the driveway and go in the basement, please. Jazakallah khair.
And you will bring the trust for me?
If you want a trust or you want a will?
So do I have to take another sign for the trust?
I do the trust, but there's 2 options, right? One is that you can do you can do a will-based plan. You don't have a trust in that. If you do a will-based plan, it's $35. If you want to do a trust-based plan, it's $5,000. Same thing for both husband and wife, it's $5,000. So it's either $3,500 or $5,000, depending if you want a trust or you don't want a trust.
No, I want the trust and the will.
So then you would do a trust.
I can even write myself.
No, you can. The thing is that there's formalities.
Only it has to be documented like properly.
So the problem is that when you do a trust, there's something called a pour-over will. You can all listen to me on it. There's something called a pour-over will. When you have a trust, you always do a pour-over will. A pour-over will is exactly what it sounds like. It says whatever, because you know you have to move your assets into the trust, right? If somebody, say you buy a house and you forget to put it into the trust, or your watches or your jewelry or anything else that you own that wasn't transferred into the trust, can all go into the trust. So what your will says is that when I pass away, whatever is not already inherited, take the time for it.
Most of them in the lifetime, they can have
So sometimes, especially women, I tell them, like, you know, sometimes you have sentimental, like your wedding set or something like that, just give it in your lifetime because it really makes things very complicated.
I give it to my daughter, and I'm the one who's speaking the document on it. Then I'm sending all the text, and they are going to get everything. And I'm paying for my retirement. I'm going to pay for all.
But jewelry makes things very complicated because it has to be, because in order to liquidate it, like, in order to split it up, sometimes you have to sell it, you don't want to sell it. So in your lifetime, just tell them take it. They pay for the back, take it. And then
I give them for my daughter read it and she gave me back. She said, Mom, I can't keep it. I might lose it. So now you keep it. So now I'm the one who is paying the zakat on that. And then rest of the things also, if you've got money and all that. And the house, and I'm saying now I have to pay the fees for the attorney also to put it. They are asking me to put in the trust.
You should put everything in a trust, and I'm going to tell you, obviously I'm saying it as the attorney, but whether you hire me, whether you hire someone else, people hesitate to spend money right now, but the amount of money they wind up spending after is so much more.
You don't put in the trust. They have to, when we pass away, the house is sold, then they have to pay more tax.
I mean, they're going to pay legal fees anyway. They're going to pay a lawyer to do probate, and when you do probate, then it takes like a year sometimes to get the stuff through probate.
And how much is your fees if we come and discuss with you?
So if you were here, you could just tell me. I'll just do for. You can do Zoom. You can do a Zoom consultation for free. If you were here, I'll do a free consultation. That's fine.
No, I have to bring my daughter with me. So free consultation means what you will explain us.
So
how it works.
So I'll have you go through this, fill it out, everything, and then during the consultation we'll go through it together, and then I can tell you this is what we do.
And that will cost me like 3,500.
When you do, well, not meeting me won't cost you 3,500, but if you do a will, it'll cost you 3,500.
No, I mean that free constitution is there. 3,500 cost me if I put the trust.
Trust is 5,000.
And trust is separate.
No, trust is all. So there's a trust-based plan and a will-based plan. A trust-based plan has two healthcare proxies, two powers of attorney, 2 wills, and 2 living wills, and a trust, and then it's 5,000. For all, like 9. Sometimes we do 2 trusts, sometimes we do 1. It depends on your estate. But it's either going to be 9 to 10. Should I turn the speaker on?
It would be 9 or 10,000.
So it would be between 9 to 10 documents. Oh, you want me to turn it off? Okay. It's between 9 to 10 documents, and